Yeah, let's go ahead and get started, I guess. We've gotten coffee, so thank you everyone for coming at 8 a.m. I think this is a really, really cool session with lots of great papers, so it's wonderful to connect with all of you. And we'll go ahead and get started off with Anna, who's at UCSB, presenting an evaluation of a zero deforestation policy in Paraguay. So 20 minutes without interruptions for anything besides clarification questions. I'll let you know when you're 5 left.
Thank you.
And then we'll have discussion afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for being here in this rainy morning. I'm very happy to present my paper on the impacts of Paraguay zero as well. This is joint work with Mr. Walker, advisor Robert Hallmeyer, Atualpa, Ayala, and Laura Sherwood, and we are all from UCSB. As a motivation, this is a picture of deforestation rates across the world between the years 2000 and 2010. And you can see that there's a lot of forest loss happening in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and this country right here, Paraguay, which had one of the highest deforestation rates in the 2010s. So in response to concerns about deforestation for obvious reasons, multiple countries have adopted conservation mandates in private lands as policy instruments to tackle deforestation. For example, in Brazil, we have the requirement of keeping 80% of a property as forest cover. And we have multiple restrictions on private lands in countries like Costa Rica, Argentina, Colombia, and Australia. And there are clear potential issues with imposing such strict mandates in private lands. Okay. So we can think about potential income impacts and equity concerns to the extent that that might restrict smallholders' ability to produce. You can think that that's very hard politically and even operationally to enforce. And you can think that that can be economically inefficient in the sense that in some properties you can think that the costs are from imposing this policy are higher than the benefits. So I'm going to talk about the zero-deforestation law, which was approved in 2004, and it was the first zero-deforestation mandate implemented in the tropics, to my knowledge, that imposed like 100% of restriction on deforestation. So, sorry, I don't know, my slides are going a bit slow. Okay. And this policy was imposed in Paraguay, which encompasses nearly half of Paraguay's territory. So in the area delineated by the orange line. And as I said, we open no concessions for any kind of conversion to other land uses. So our research question is, what was this policy impact on deforestation? And just as a preview, we use a synthetic difference and differences approach, and we find no statistically significant impact of this policy. And we discuss in light of 3 contributing factors. First, there's a lack of a systematic deforestation monitoring system, and we're going to talk a bit about that. There are some very surprising and interesting issues with how the law was actually prosecuted. And there are also some conflicts with agrarian reform policy. So these results might not be surprising for people in the room, given how harsh the policy is. But this policy was actually celebrated at first, in the first 2 initial years, that it was working great, even though the evidence is a bit funky. And then a few years later, there was a lot of backlash in the Paraguayan civil society. But then, when the policy in 2020 was up to be renewed, there was a big push towards, yeah, let's extend this again because this is the best policies we can get. So even though this is a no impact paper, I still think that it's relevant to talk about it because there's still a belief among many institutions in the Paraguay society that this is the best policy we can possibly have. So a bit of context, and just before, I think this paper speaks to this literature discussing what are the de facto like challenges for developing countries to implement environmental policy. So I think this speaks a bit to the paper parts literature showing that just implementing a protected area doesn't mean anything if you don't have state capacity enforcement. And also to the literature that having strategically targeted environmental policy in a resource constrained context, which is the developing world context, is really important. And also it speaks to the other, to the literature investigating the other zero deforestation mandates, which discuss how each context is very idiosyncratic. And so I think it's interesting to look at the Paraguayan context. Just a brief background on the policy. This policy was being discussed among severe pressure on the Atlantic forest. The Atlantic forest is a biome that spans across Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. The area within Paraguay, the regional area is where this green shaded area is. So just to give an example, forest cover went down from 75% in the 70s to only 24% in the 2000s. And actually, if you look at the 2000-2005 period, Paraguay actually had the highest deforestation in the world in the humid tropics. So the policy debate started as a social pact, and there was an ongoing discussion between WWF and the Paraguay's vice president, and that shifted to the zero deforestation law, which was approved in late 2004. And the goal of this policy was actually to protect the Atlantic forest biome. But even though the target was Atlantic forest, they banned all kinds of deforestation within eastern Paraguay. That was a pre-existing political division of the country. For my empirical strategy, we have clear issue here if you might think to conduct like a GID comparison between East and West. I think that's where our mind goes first to establish a comparison. But of course, you can think that this policy might have deforestation, might cause deforestation spillovers to Western Paraguay and untreated area, causing some violations. So ideally, the setting here wouldn't be adequate. And the way we chose to tackle this empirical challenge is by following the synthetic differences approach. And we do that by constructing, even though it sounds fancy, synthetic difference is just a synthetic, is very similar to the definition of a synthetic control in the sense that we're constructing a pre-policy counterfactual trajectory, and we analyze it post-policy. So we construct this counterfactual, which would be the Eastern Paraguay in the absence of the policy. And to construct that counterfactual, we use subnational regions of South America as our donor pool. So just to briefly explain what the method does, imagine a DAD setting. We want to estimate the effect of being exposed to a policy given by the towel here, and we will find our parameter of interest by solving this minimization problem. In the synthetic differences, we are solving a very similar problem with the difference that we have this unit and time weights. And I'll explain what these weights do. So the unit weights have the role of constructing this pretreatment parallel trend. So we're matching the trends between the non-treated units with our treated unit, Eastern Paraguay. And time weights are introduced to balance pre and post treatment and avoid that our trend is created driven by time periods which are outliers for them. So in our setting, we estimate these weights, and then we follow this kind of weighted DID in which our outcome of interest is the deforestation rate in each unit at each time period. And then our treated units are the 13 departments in Eastern Paraguay. And our pool, which will be like a weighted average, will be the other South American departments. We do this analysis from 1986 to 2020, and we exclude Western Paraguay due to the spillovers, and we also exclude the Brazilian Amazon. Sorry, we're still here, but we exclude the Brazilian Amazon because in 2004 onwards, multiple policies were implemented to tackle deforestation. And our data, we combine multiple microbiome products covering all of the South American countries. Unfortunately, there's no data for Chile. That's the reason why Chile is not in our analysis. And we calculate the year deforestation rates for each one of those regions. And we use those deforestation rates to construct our policy counterfactual. Our results, here it's the plot of our synthetic control in East Paraguay. This method is different from the synthetic control in the sense that we don't exactly match on the level and on the trend. We match only on the trend. And we also impose those time weights, which also change how each period is constructed. And so we find, and this outcome, the outcome of interest is in percentage points. So you can interpret this estimate as percentage points. So first, it is not significant, but also I haven't worked on any bounding exercises, but at best, it's a 0.1 percentage point reduction in deforestation, which is very minor given the level of deforestation that we had in Paraguay. And our results are robust to multiple specifications, so we vary the donor pool, dropping neighborhood countries on the sample, because you might think there's spillovers, or maybe our results are being driven by a specific country. We vary our pre and post-treatment period windows, because you might also be concerned that our counterfactual is being constructed based on a very specific sample, and the post-treatment period, you might think that there are structural breaks and that our trends wouldn't be valid to be extended in such a post-treatment period. We vary how we calculate the deforestation, and we also do an analysis considering the forest area outside protected areas. And our results don't change much. So I would like to discuss these results in light of the three factors that we raised. This came from, I had the luck to go to Paraguay and talk to the environmental agency and to stakeholders that participated in this policy discussion. And this is a bit from what I learned as well. So I feel very, very lucky that I have such close contact. So deforestation monitoring was clearly an issue. The agency was very clear that they had no tools to track deforestation except from anonymous complaints. And the agency actually had, you might think, oh, maybe they're understaffed and they don't have capacity, but they had 17 regional offices spread across the country, which I know in the eastern area, and but still they have no guidance on how to conduct environmental monitoring, and until 2020 actually. A new decree was approved recently to change that. And it's very curious that actually WWF had a whole GIS lab that was contributing with deforestation monitoring in Paraguay, and was producing this result, this deforestation tracking, and producing these documents. And they claimed that they were being forwarded to the government, but the government actually never responded to any of this deforestation monitoring. And there is a general consensus when I spoke to people in Paraguay that no one was ever arrested because of this policy, and very few people were actually prosecuted. And when even when they were, the financial punishment was very, very small, which is what I talk here right now. So the sanctions also were very small, and there's this consensus that no one ever would be arrested for deforesting in Paraguay, and the fines are very small, right, relative to the profits from using the deforested land. So if you calculate in today's dollars, it's between $7,000 to $8,000, regardless of how much you deforest. And also, there's just this discussion on how the legal system has very little apparatus and technical knowledge, for example, to investigate these cases. So many of them are never actually investigated, and they just expired. The time to prosecute them expires, nothing really happens. And also, very interesting, this Anguayo did this work looking to the actual court cases. And it's a small sample, but it's very interesting that judges, for example, have, in one case, the judge established no punishment because he claimed it was like 35 hectares of forest that had been deforested. Claimed, oh, that's so little, look, I'm not going to impose any punishment, even though the law does establish no differentiation between what is deforested and not. In theory, anything above 2 hectares of forest would be should be subject to the law of punishment. And then lastly, I want to talk about the conflicts with the agrarian foreign policy. I unfortunately don't have much time to talk about the role of agrarian reform in Paraguay, but it's a country historically with many land distribution and
3 minutes, 4 minutes.
Issues with land distribution with the dictatorship. Vast plots of lands were distributed to people aligned with the government. So we have huge land inequalities. So ever since Paraguay became a democracy again in the 90s, there has been a big push towards agrarian reform. And I cannot claim this because I don't have information on when each plot was allocated, but you can imagine that the land available for allocation is usually forest land. And just in post-policy, 2004-2020, we know that over 70,000 plots of land were allocated in agrarian reform policy. And then we analyze what happens in these plots using remote sense data that our team has worked on, that is was created to map smallholder agriculture. And what we do here is that we use the forest cover baseline in 2004, and we want to look at our maps to understand what happened in those forest areas since the policy was implemented. So again, for lack of time, I won't be able to talk too much about what happened, but we find that roughly 1 million hectares of forest were lost since the policy. And we also find that at least 20% of that forest loss was within the agrarian reform colonies. So this is the distribution of the colonies. Again, unfortunately, I cannot tell you which one of these were distributed post-policy, but from talking with government agents, there was this big conflict within the government. So the environmental agency having to implement this policy, and in their just distributing forest land. And so here we show that we can say that at least half of the plots, this is relative to, this is all area that used to be forest. And this is the breakdown if you look at 2022, and nearly half of the plots have lost forest cover. So just to wrap up, we can say that this policy, so basically a paper policy between until 2020, which is the time of my analysis. And just to be fair here, Paraguay is pushing for important change right now. So they have implemented they are in the process of implementing a near real-time deforestation monitoring system, which can be very important. And they also have new guidelines for the environmental agents. But again, these issues with the legal system and this conflict with the agrarian reform institution are still going to persist. And I just want to wrap up reinforcing that as researchers and policymakers, we need to think, is zero deforestation really the optimal policy? And for example, in the case of agrarian reform, it's very obvious that that can have very important social and equity and benefits related to equity as well. So how do we accommodate these two different needs? And that was the presentation. Thank you so much. This is my contact, and I'm looking forward for your questions. Yes.
So I understand why at Xanthi you didn't want it to be a regression continuity
Yeah.
because of spillovers, but now that you find null effect, can you do the boundary regression
Yeah.
discontinuity as another way for readers to visually see like indeed
Yeah.
policy is really not doing
Yeah,
anything?
I think that's a great idea. I was just a bit hesitant because I cannot a priori say that the no spillovers assumption is being respected in that setting. So that's why I thought it would be a bit weird to after final results to test it, but maybe it would be like a good way of showing that there's no discontinuity. Do you think that's a
Well, I'm just thinking of policymakers. Like I think
Okay.
this is an important paper for people to see, and so for readers who don't
Yeah.
know synthetic differences, people like lay people really understand and
Yeah.
believe RD. So it just feels like you
Okay.
can do it now.
That I know.
Established. There's no spill. You only can't do the RD if there's spillovers. So
Yeah.
you're showing there's no spill.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So do you see? So even though you find insignificant impact, do you see how the type of deforestation is being affected by this policy? For example, we may have very large scale plantation farms, so that we have large scale deforestation, or even though the total deforestation size is same, we may have dispersed many small scale
Yeah.
deforestation patches.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I still haven't done that.
Yeah, the difficulty of monitoring is different at different.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, what I can show you, because our data came out just recently, is that our data can tell us something about maybe how much is within smallholder and large scale, because again, our data was created to map smallholder agriculture, which I think is the big advantage here, because we can, even though I cannot say much about the size of the deforested plot, I can tell you what was converted later to smallholder versus soil, for example. And then we can imagine that those are two very different kinds of deforestation.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I don't have, I haven't looked at the deforestation plots themselves. But as we're showing here, most of it is driven by grassland and soybeans, which are large-scale agriculture in Paraguay, and very little by smallholder. So, and there's evidence that the plots that were being deforested were massive. So, but I still need to look more into detail.
Good.
Yeah. Yes.
Hello, I'm with Andy. I hear that the cameras are backing. Do you mind if I do some
Oh yeah.
transition now?
Sure. In the meantime,
Yeah.
I'm just following up on Gabriel's point. Like, I think that you could also use the boundary discontinuity with Argentina and Brazil right there,
Yeah.
right? So which maybe it's harder to do spillovers across the border,
Yeah.
right? That's similar, like Burgess and others have a paper
Yeah.
looking at Brazil over a long period of time. And for me, that would be a quite convincing extra
Yeah.
analysis, not substituting what
Yeah.
you've done, but just like you said, like I think it can be a nice visual, clear way to show some
Yeah.
impact.
That's
And I
great.
would not be so concerned with spillovers across that national border.
Yeah.
And also it's the same biome, it's not targeted by Amazon policies, right? It's
Yeah.
Mata Blanca right there as well.
Exactly. What is interesting though is that for example, the border with Brazil, there's a lot of migration
Sure.
from Brazil to the Atlantic forest in Paraguay. So you can even say that most of the deforestation in Paraguay happened because of Brazilian farmers that moved there looking for cheap land. So there is this caveat at looking at the border because Paraguay was just very open to Brazilian farmers to move to those neighboring cities. But yeah, so that, yeah.
But that's a great idea. Thank you so much.
Okay, and if there's no other comments and questions, follow up afterwards with Anna, and
Thank you.
we'll shift to our second presenter.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Ana Reparata-Scovia. I am a research associate at the World Resources Institute. But I will be presenting research that I did as part of my doctoral work at Boston University. My presentation is titled Making a Difference Takes Time, Comparing the Impacts of Two Direct Conservation Interventions on Forest Cover in a Biodiversity Hotspot. And this work was done in collaboration with remote sensors and people in Colombia at the Humboldt Institute. Okay, as many of you are all too well aware, tropical forest systems like those found in the Colombian Andes continue to be degraded and destroyed. This is a persistent environmental problem that we don't seem to be able to solve. Billions of dollars are being spent to prevent forest loss, but as researchers, we're still building an evidence base as to what extent different interventions work in different contexts. Most research on conservation interventions centers on protected areas, which work well in many contexts, but seeing as people live in some of these areas, these carry potential risks of displacing local people and depriving them of their livelihoods, and they're not always effective in areas that don't have great management, as Anna said. So therefore, there's interest in conservation instruments to provide compensation to landowners for ceding their land use rights, including land acquisitions, and I'm talking here about public land acquisitions, and also payments for environmental services. And we know less about the causal impacts of these interventions on forest cover in the tropics. There have been many studies on PES, but causal impact evaluations are clustered to a couple of programs in a few locations. And while there's literature on land acquisitions in developed countries, there's a lot less in the tropics because these land acquisitions for forest conservation are less prevalent. And also there are instances in the literature where the impacts of more than one instrument are compared to effectiveness. So that's something that we do here. Just to talk more about what these instruments are, payments for ecosystem services are arrangements between buyers and sellers where payments is made so long as ecosystem services are rendered. It involves a temporary transfer of partial land use rights in exchange for a payment. Public land acquisitions, on the other hand, happen through a lump sum payment where the permanent transfer of all land use rights is made to a government entity. And as you will see, it's not obvious which one will do better in a given context. So I thought it would be interesting to compare these and was provided by the opportunity to do so because of unique policies in Colombia that have provided sustained funding for both land acquisitions and payments for ecosystem services. And these are specifically to protect water-related ecosystem services provided by forests. So they're watershed investments. So Article 111 of Law of 1993, which is part of Colombia's environmental law or general environmental law, states that 1% of current income to departments and municipalities has to be spent on buying land for water conservation. And this originally represented a national sum equivalent to 1/3 of the budget for the national environmental system. In 2013, this law was amended to allow for the same funds to be spent on payments for ecosystem services. So as these funds can be spent on either instrument, there's not just theoretical reasons to compare the cost effectiveness, but also practical ones for Colombia where they have to make a decision on where to spend their money. And it's not obvious as to which will perform better. So either instrument can fail to reduce deforestation if it tends to target areas that would have remained forested regardless of the intervention, such as areas with low deforestation pressure. But there's not a lot of evidence as to how these two instruments differ with respect to how exposed participating parcels are to deforestation risk. Payments for ecosystems or environmental services are known to be prone to suffer from adverse selection because people are more likely to participate in a voluntary program if they do not have strong incentives to deforest. Although also land acquisitions can suffer from a similar thing because they may be acquired due to a low purchase price, which can be related to low conversion threats. However, if they're both reducing deforestation at equal rates, and payments for environmental services can have more overall impact by being more easy to implement over large areas for a similar or lower budget, so accumulating more impact across space. But the temporary nature of it could lead to less cumulative impacts than land acquisitions over time. But also, PES has land users protecting their parcels. They have an incentive to do so, whereas public land acquisitions has the government protecting the parcels, and in areas of low governance, then there can be encroachment onto these parcels. But yeah, this can all be further complicated when they're used in combination with other interventions, such as protected areas, which they are in these situations. Okay, so we are looking at a specific region, Eastern Antioquia, which was the area where the environmental agency was the first to start implementing PES with these funds. The environmental agency is CORNARE, and they started implementing this in 2014 with a program called Banco Dos, which is run by Max Bosques. Anyway, it's complicated. But they specifically target lower income households with forests, and they provide payments every month of roughly $90 US, which is roughly 40% of the national monthly minimum wage. There's no pay differential based on forest area or on opportunity cost. This program has since expanded to 16 additional Colombian departments. So just for some more local context, the study area has high socio-ecological diversity. On one side, it's closer to Medellin, a major city. There's higher income. On the other side, it's a higher elevation. On the other side, lower elevation areas with much higher deforestation pressure and lower income. This area was affected by the violent conflict and forced displacement, so managers have strong reasons to want to keep people on their lands, and therefore that makes payments for ecosystem services a little bit more politically favorable. And also land acquisitions can be complicated by high levels of land tenure informality, especially in the areas with higher deforestation pressure and lower elevations. So this can all lead policymakers to prefer PES to land acquisitions, although some are more convinced about land acquisitions for providing forest outcomes. So finally, to our research question. So the question overarching was, how do PES and PLA, public land acquisitions, compare in terms of cost effectiveness? And this we divided into 4 separate questions. How do PES and PLA differ in the number and extent of their application in the region, as well as in the amount spent on these 2 instruments, so their implementation? How do they differ in characteristics that affect risk of forest loss prior to any treatment? How do they differ in impacts on forest cover, and how do they compare on their return on investment? And secondly, we wanted to know what are the equity concerns for public land acquisitions and PES as implemented, because we know about some concerns of land acquisitions and we wanted to, or protected areas, and we wanted to know more about these instruments. So getting into the study design, so our unit of analysis was the area of forest cover at the parcel level. We drew treated parcels and untreated parcels from the rural cadastre map provided by Antioquia's geodatabase. And you can see the dates of the treatments here. And we also used remote sensing data from 1997 to 2021 that provided us with forest loss and forest gain information. We ran matching separately for PES and public land acquisitions. These are all the variables that we used for matching. We ran exact matching for sub-region, and if they were in a protected area, PA category. And then we had time variant matching variables like PA status, percent forest cover before treatment, and previous deforestation in a time in a radius for a time lag. So we ran this matching through Mahalo Novus nearest distance neighbor matching, and then we run difference and differences for multiple time periods, which we use because of staggered implementation. And this is from Callaway and Santana's 2021 paper. And this led to our percent estimated impact, which using the staggered DID, we can look at impacts per treatment cohort. So all parcels that were treated in the same year, or per time of treatment exposure. So all parcels, 1 year after exposure, 2 years after exposure, et cetera. And then we also conducted surveys with people who participated in the Payments for Ecosystem Services program, people who sold their lands, and interviews with project managers to help explain the results and give us some idea of the equity implications. So where did we get our data? So for the PES, we got our data from the environmental agencies, the program, and from the municipalities. For the land acquisitions data, we also got data from the environmental agency, CORDANE, the department governments, and the municipalities. This was parcel level data, and this is where we got the year of purchase or start of payment.
Just clarification.
Yes.
For PES, they are paying $90 to households with forests. Conditional on protecting forests? Conditional on cutting nothing?
Yes.
Okay. Please pick some up.
Yes.
So conditional on zero. No continuous.
Yeah.
I see.
Okay. So yeah, the Colombian Andes, complex dynamic landscape. Remote sensing is a challenge here because you can see all of this elevational gradient and all these mixed land uses. So we actually developed remote sensing maps specifically for the Colombian Andes that could give us forest loss, forest gain, and stable forest. Here's me doing surveys. I talked to about 50 payments for ecosystem service or environment. I keep saying ecosystem. PES participants. About 8 people who sold their lands. It was difficult to find them, and then controls, and then also program managers, etc. Okay, into our results. What are the implementation differences? So our lower bound estimates give us that in this area, because in all of Colombia this is different, PES enrolled either more or equal to 2,677 parcels, covering about 67,000 hectares at an estimated cost of $5.5 million US. Public land acquisitions affected about 700 parcels, covering about 9,000 hectares at the cost of between $32 and $48 million. So you can see that much more costly and with less parcels covered. Payments for ecosystem services, as I discussed before, implemented in a larger area in a shorter time in areas more vulnerable to deforestation. So most of the land acquisitions are happening on this side, which is closer to Medellin, which is over here. Here you can see the protected areas are in light green, and there's overlap between where some parcels are bought and which are pink and the protected areas. Also, the payments for services, there's a lot of overlap with the protected areas, but you can see that there's a lot more happening on this side that has higher deforestation pressure. And you can see that kind of the payments for ecosystem services are implemented in areas of lower elevations than public land acquisitions. And that's one of the main differences in how slightly higher predicted deforestation between treatment groups. Okay, so PES was easier to implement in areas with higher land tenure informality, less income, and more threatened ecosystems. So if we look at this graph, it's showing the different subregions within this area, and there's a lot of lines here, sorry. But you can see that payments for ecosystem services, most of it was implemented in the Altiplano region, which has low ecosystem endangeredness, high levels of income, and low levels of land tenure informality. Whereas in areas with much higher levels of land tenure informality, we get a lot more PES because it doesn't require formal documentation. And also in areas with higher ecosystem endangerment, we get a lot more PES, with the exception of Namibia, which has a lot of deforestation pressure, and neither of these programs were implemented very much there. Okay, so here are the differences impacts. So here we're seeing cohort level impact. So all parcels treated in 2019, what are their impacts, 2018, 2017, etc. And here you can also see the cumulative deforestation pressure as kind of a reference point over this time period. And so you can see that there are some group level impacts here, but they're very small in percentage wise relative to the public land acquisitions percentage impacts. And this is true kind of regardless of how we ran this, what kind of remote sensing data we used, whether we include gain. It was true for different matching specifications. But one thing that did differ was the total impact area, because small changes in percentage impacts for PES could lead this to have higher area impacts just because of the huge area difference. But we do see consistently that public land acquisitions have higher percentage impacts. Okay. And if we look at the exposure level, we can see how this changes over time, right? So no impacts pre-treatment, and then as we get into maybe 6 to 7 years post-treatment, we start seeing effects from PES, whereas with public land acquisitions, we start seeing these effects right away. They go up really quickly, and a lot more. And this isn't as steep if we don't include gain. It's more like this. So we're seeing that a lot of our effects from public land acquisitions are actually from forest gain and not from avoided deforestation. Whereas for PES, there's not as much room for forest gain because people are still using those lands productively. So we're not getting that same effect.
They said to appear on the camera, and it would be best to sit there, I guess,
Oh.
and not stand up
Oh,
here.
I'm sorry. I just
No.
wanted to do this for you guys.
It's whatever you,
I
it's
didn't
whatever
know
you want.
people were watching. Okay. Regardless, okay, there's no strong evidence that one is more cost effective than the other. And these results should be indicative because we didn't have any programmatic costs. We only had costs of the payments and the acquisitions, but we don't have strong evidence to show that one is more cost effective. And this is sensitive also to the discount rate. Anyway, we can talk about that later. Okay, so let's talk about equity implications from the survey data. For PES, and this is more from interviews and also surveys, but we find that the selection process did not ensure additionality for forest outcomes. So people were selected based on income and also whether they were in priority areas, but there was no analysis to see, okay, were these people likely to deforest in the future? And this could potentially explain the low outcomes. There were a lot of people participating in the program who had retired and weren't even living on those parcels, or people who said that they wouldn't have deforested anyway. Also, the payments were not high enough to fully compensate opportunity costs. So we talked to a lot of people who previously were in forestry and how much they made, and these payments were not enough to cover that. So we're getting a lot of selection for people who would not enter the program voluntarily, just because it didn't cover their opportunity costs. Also, there were some distributional equity situations and contextual and structural equity where payments sometimes arrive late or not at all. So the program had kind of the power to insist that people did not deforest, but the people did not have the power to insist that they got the payments for not deforesting, and this was a huge problem. It was good that PES gave people living in protected areas the ability to stay on their lands. There were several situations where people would have had to leave were it not for these programs. But the payment was not offered to the most marginalized people, which were those who were living very informally on other people's lands. Okay, for the public land acquisitions, we find that the process is too slow, and this can be very difficult for landowners. There was one person who had been trying to sell their parcel for 23 years, and each time the administration changed, they would have to start over, and this was accruing very significant economic impacts on that person. Selling to the government could be a financial burden to landowners because they had to pay for all the costs to get their titles cleaned and their land surveyed. So they actually did so at a loss compared to selling to a private buyer. And in protected areas especially, the process was not always entirely voluntary because they couldn't sell to other landowners because nobody could cultivate there, so they had to kind of sell to the government. And also, what some people try to negotiate a land price, they were threatened with expropriation because as part of the public interest, they could actually expropriate lands from people. So to kind of conclude, payments for ecosystem services had lower upfront costs, less stringent land tenure requirements, political favorability, and lower commitment levels, which favored their implementation. And payments for ecosystem services, environmental, avoided forest loss or increased forest gain at lower rates compared to public land acquisitions. PES were estimated to mostly avoid forest loss, while the estimated effects of land acquisitions were mostly driven by apparent reforestation or forest regeneration. And yeah, we can discuss this further, but the point that we make is that the choice between similar cost-effective instruments depends on environmental needs, so whether you want to conserve forests or have secondary forests, capacity of implementing bodies, and the land user's context so that there's not equity concerns. Better targeting for both payments for ecosystem services and land acquisitions would consider costs, projected benefits, and threat. And this is needed for both instruments given the high cost for relatively low levels of impact. And some ways of improving equity and environmental outcomes could be to cover the transaction costs for land acquisitions and to increase payments and require longer-term commitments for payments for environmental services. That's all I have for you. I went slightly over time, sorry. That's lots of people to acknowledge, obviously. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, this is really interesting. I thought that it's really sort of taking into account the contextual details. You clearly really understood the context, and comparing these two, thinking about the trade-offs between these two is super interesting. One thing I would love to see would be sort of heterogeneity analysis for both of these with by different characteristics. So you could think that for a much smaller property, the $90 a month is larger per hectare, and so you might expect it to have more impact. Or, like you said, places with lower deforestation risks, right? So I think breaking down these event studies by these different characteristics would be super useful in understanding where it's more effective.
Yeah, so we did do that. I didn't include it in the presentation because I wouldn't have time to talk about it, but thanks for asking. So yes, we did divide it by area, and surprisingly, we did not find higher percentage impacts based on higher than median area and lower than median area for either of these. But we did find higher percentage impacts for areas that were at low elevation or at higher deforestation pressure prior to treatment. So yeah, that suggests better targeting through selecting for those areas. And we found higher impacts on land cover outside of protected areas as well. Yes.
Did you follow up with any of the PES farms and see if they continued to participate? And if they didn't, if there was kind of an increase in deforestation? Because I know that's one of the fears with PES in general. So I just wanted to know if you looked at that at all.
Yeah, we did. We looked at dropouts from the program and whether there were any increases in deforestation after dropping. We didn't find a lot of evidence of that. We found, people mostly were dropped from the program if they did deforest, and then, but there were not a lot of people who just cleared their land after being dropped from the program.
Okay.
Yeah. That's not to say that the program caused that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Questions?
So the people who sell their land, they leave it permanently. It's not like a conservation easement where they can stay, but they just give up use rights. they're selling and they
They're
want.
selling, they leave, yeah, conservation easements are a thing that requires, very strong property rights. Right, which are possible in the United States, but there's not really like a legal framework to do that in Colombia.
So the people who are opting into selling their land, they're the ones who they want to leave, move to the city or something, and then any other questions or Anna? Thank you so much. Your slides are set up?
I think so, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, so our next presenter is Kinsuke Suda from University of Essex, and presenting work about a spatial model of the Peruvian Amazon.
Alright, so thank you all for coming here and for having me. I'm Shinsuke, and I'm happy to present this paper, Economies of Density and Conservation in the Amazon Rainforest, which is a joint work with Yoshiko Kamasaki and Mari Tanaka both at the University of Tokyo. Oh, I guess I saw this program yesterday as well.
Yeah, we did see this, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you remember? Yeah,
So I think if you opened it directly from the original,
original what? Sorry.
So wait, what was it okay now if you went if you scroll down?
Oh yeah.
No.
Maybe save it to the desktop.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
it needed to be
okay.
saved on the desktop.
Without using this USB.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there we go. And they also suggested that for the camera, it has to sit actually here, I guess.
Okay, great. Okay. Great. Okay, so I focus on
Sorry, so they said it for, I guess, I think there's people potentially watching online, and they said you have to sit, like sitting here in this,
sit here.
no, like this chair here.
Oh, I see. I should see it.
I guess for people to be able to see it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Let's check it out.
There's a whole setup, I guess.
Okay. I see. This is my first time. Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
No. Okay. So anyway. Okay. So conserving tropical forests is the key, global efforts to slow climate change and preserve biodiversity. I will just jump into the papers. I focus on some kind of underdeveloped rainforest areas where we have growing concerns about the role of small-scale farmers in conservation. In this kind of environment, the policymakers face the inherent trade-off between conserving tropical forests and improving local population welfare. If we increase the cost of forest clearing, we may reduce deforestation, but agricultural income may be reduced, so that human welfare, local population welfare may be reduced. But in addition, sectoral reallocation or spatial reallocation of economic activities may also undermine conservation policy goals. For example, even if we increase the cost of forest clearing, population may just shift from agriculture to other kinds of natural resource extraction activities such as fishing and hunting. That could lead to more biodiversity loss. That is, reducing one environmental cost may increase another environmental cost. Or if we set protected place-based protected areas to restrict human settlement in some regions, then population just may move from that area to other areas, such that the impact on total overall resource depletion is not clear. So considering these general equilibrium forces, this paper asks how we can design policies that improve both local population welfare and ecological conservation. And to answer this question, this paper argues that the rural agglomeration economies are playing an important role in conserving the forests by taking following steps. So first, we build a spatial general equilibrium model with density externalities in multiple rural sectors, just to make definition clear. If population density increases, higher population density increases productivity, it's agglomeration. And in contrast, if higher density decreases productivity, it's congestion. Then we estimate the model using data from river basins in the Peruvian Amazon and exploiting plausibly exogenous variation in the structure of river networks. And then we find these are two important results of the estimation. First, we find a strong agglomeration externality in agricultural production and marketing. And more importantly, this agglomeration externality outweighs congestion forces in access to land, which implies that higher concentration, higher population density in a particular community leads to higher productivity as well as less deforestation per farmer. Second, we also find strong congestion externality with spatial spillovers from surrounding populations in natural resource extraction based on the spatial competition mechanism over finite resource endowments. And then counterfactual simulations demonstrates that combining well-targeted place-based protection policies and transport infrastructure simultaneously improve achieve higher welfare of local population, less deforestation, and less natural resource depletion. And by saying well-targeted means that spatial targeting of place-based policies is very important, which I will show later on. Okay, this is the end of introduction. And the study area is the Peruvian Amazon. There are two important reasons why this is an ideal setting to study fundamental human-nature interactions. First, people engage in traditional ways of life in remote areas without much of modern technology and large-scale external investments. This feature enables me to attribute resource extractions to small-scale farmers and hunter-gatherers, such that we can focus on externalities that they cause. Okay? And indeed, the primary livelihoods in this, by the way, this is the Peruvian Amazon. And the primary livelihoods in this area include agriculture in the traditional form of system cultivation, fishing, hunting, and other forest products. But just one more, timber extraction by local farmers is very minor. Okay? And indeed, that's why I asked you, but you know, small scale deforestation, small patches of deforestation has been increasing a lot in recent years, like this paper shows. And the second, river networks almost solely constitute the transportation routes without roads. That allows me to identify key structural parameters by exploiting the exogenous river shapes. And I'm showing, so the data is coming from these 4 major river basins in the Peruvian Amazon. And in the model, I consider general equilibrium in each of these river basins. So given the time, I want to just focus on this one. So the main data source is the community census. Original community census for almost all rural communities in the 4 major river basins. And I rely on this data for many variables such as population, prices, and so on to estimate structural models as well as to investigate mechanisms. And we complement this data. We use satellite images, of course, to measure forest covers, both at political level and community level, and we complement this data by using some other publicly available national censuses. Okay, so these are the main data sources. And let me just, I said there are 4 river basins, but let me just focus on one river basin for good illustration. So this is one major river basin. This is Pucallpa. This is a very big urban center, but most other locations are rural communities. This legend shows population. Darker sizes have higher populations. So this is based on quantile, which means that in this case, about 80% of rural communities have a population less than 320. So there are many very small scale communities and only a few very large communities. And indeed, these are mostly indigenous communities. And actually, our data shows that colonial settlements have only about 1.4% of rural communities are colonial settlements. Okay, so this is the kind of picture of population. And okay, so now let's look at the deforestation. So obviously, we see significant overlap between the community locations of higher populations and deforestation. But anyway, the positive relationship between human settlements and deforestation is not surprising at all. But what's more important is the relationship between population size, community population size, and per capita deforestation. How much each farmer deforests. That's not obvious, and that's more important to for aggregate total deforestation. So here we see, so I'm using two types of land footprint. This is forest loss, overtime forest loss, deforestation, and this is just a static non-forest area without forests. But whichever land footprint measure I use, we find a strong negative and convex relationship between population size and per capita land footprint around each community. This is based on the within the deforested areas within 2 kilometers from each community center. But actually, this relationship looks robust to different farm sizes. So anyway, this motivates our model, and just as a simple thought experiment, suppose let's take this as structure, although this is correlation. Now, let's take this as a structure. Then this relationship implies two things. First is the presence of some kind of condition forces in forest clearing for the open access forest, even without land market. And the second, and more importantly, this implies that a mean preserving reduction in the variance of the settlement site can reduce total deforestation if this convexity is sufficiently strong. This means that having more medium-sized communities than having many medium-sized communities may reduce total deforestation than having some very small communities and some very large communities. Okay? So this implies that even holding total population in the river basin fixed, constant, spatially reallocating population can reduce total deforestation. This is the implication, and this motivates our model and counter functions. All right, so let me briefly describe the model. So we consider spatial general equilibrium in the river basin, incorporating trade across different rural locations and one urban center through the river network based on arising from comparative advantage across different locations in three sectors. And the three sectors are, by the way, and we consider mobile population but within the river basin as is consistent with indigeneity in this area. Okay? And then we consider three sectors, and 2 rural sectors and 1 urban sector. Agriculture and natural resource extraction are the 2 rural sectors produced only in the rural communities, and the urban group is only produced in the urban sector. Then the intuition behind the spatial equilibrium is that the spatial distribution of economic activities is determined by the balance between abundant concentration and dispersion forces, including agglomeration externality in agricultural production and condition forces in resource extractions. So now let me just focus on the agricultural production, which consists of 2 steps. So in the first step, farmers clear forests using NO, farmers in community O use NOL labor for producing a variety of J crops to first obtain land. Okay? And then in the second step, using NOC labor for cropping and obtain land in the first step to produce the final output of crop J, okay? Variety J. Okay? Then let's look at the productivity terms, which are the key of this paper. 2 important parameters. The first, mu L is the parameter governing condition forces in forest clearing. Okay? This means that higher total agricultural population decrease its productivity of forest clearing. So this is, given high monitoring cost with weak property rights and high cost of carrying products from inland to riverside, actually farmers clear forests to obtain land only nearby their residential locations along the river. Actually, our satellite data shows that land depth, like the distance from the riverside to the inland is almost about 1 kilometer. What is 1 kilometer? Median is less than 1 kilometer. And at the same time, cost of monitoring and negotiating land allocations to farmers increase with the agricultural population, such that these forested areas cannot just increase proportionally to the increase in with agricultural the community population size. But at the same time, these costs may be very small among very small communities. For example, if we have only 3 people, okay, then you cut here and you deforest here and I do here. And also we can cooperate to clear forests so that, these costs may be very small among very small communities, but once population size increases up to the moderate size, this cost may increase significantly. If this is the case, this is very consistent with the complexity that I explained before. Okay? So this is the intuition behind the congestion forces in land access, and the next important parameter is mu r. This is the parameter governing the agglomeration forces in agricultural production and marketing. For example, by sharing collective investments and so on. I don't have time for this 20 minutes presentation, but I'm happy to talk about the mechanism behind this agglomeration. But this means that higher total agricultural population leads to higher productivity in this second step. Okay? And whether this agglomeration outweighs this congestion is purely an empirical question. We don't know anything if without which is bigger, right? Okay. All right. So this is the kind of structure of the agricultural production, and let me just jump into estimation first to estimate how to see how to estimate these parameters. All right. So okay, I will introduce these parameters later. But anyway, we first obtain some parameters without solving the model, and we solve and invert the model to recover unobservable productivity that rationalize the observed sectoral populations as a spatial equilibrium in the second step. And then we employ GMM to estimate parameters governing the density externalities in productivities. Okay? So this is the productivity fundamentals obtained in the previous estimation step, and then this is in the agricultural production. So we got these productivities in all locations by solving the model, which consists of productivity fundamentals such as soil condition and many other things, and externalities arising from the agricultural population density. But this is, a composite. This mu and tilde is a composite of the agglomeration externality in agriculture and the congestion forces in forest clearing. Okay? So, but we want to estimate these 2 parameters. So to approach them, we first estimate this mu and tilde. Second, we estimate this congestion forces, and then finally we can back out the agglomeration externality. So we take log, and of course, we may have higher populations in locations with higher unobservable productivity, so that we should instrument this population size. We use access called river network access as an IB for log population, and this is just in case. This is the weighted sum to the accessibility to all other locations through the river, regardless of not whether these areas have positive populations. Okay, so this, the intention is that if you look at similar areas like pink, red, and brown areas, then we are exploiting the variation in between these locations stemming from connectivity to other locations in areas further from these locations, okay? Which would be correlated with a very uncorrelated would be unobservable productivity differences in these three locations. But at the same time, these three locations have different connectivity to other areas, which has, for example, in this case, brown area has higher market potential. That could achieve higher employment in this area, in this brown cell than this pink cell. Therefore, this remote access can affect productivity through employment and that's through the density externalities. Okay, this is the exclusion restriction. This is the identification strategy, and actually, you see that the productivity fundamentals for forest clearing are also included in this productivity fundamentals in this set. This means that if we can use another variation in the outcome variable, we can use the same identification strategy to estimate mu parameter as well, using this community level landscape community information. All right, so this is how to estimate these parameters. But let me just give you the results. Importantly, we find a significant positive estimate for mu and tilde, which consists of agglomeration externality and dispersion congestion externality. This is very important, and this is one of the main results of the estimation. This means that this agglomeration outweighs congestion forces in access to land. That's why higher population density in a community achieves higher productivity and less deforestation per farmer. Okay? And also, we find that this agglomeration externality in agriculture, which we talked about, is quantitatively important. If we shut down this parameter to 0, then welfare is decreased by about 10%, and the total deforestation is increased by about 30%. Okay. And then, next, I introduced this for the first time. We have another natural resource extraction sector, which has this production function. In contrast to agriculture, I don't use land to produce this resource extraction because I travel for fishing. I travel to somewhere else to hunt animals and so on, right? Okay. All right. That's why we have the labor is the only input, but we have conditional externalities in resource extraction, but with spatial spillovers from surrounding populations. This new governs the spatial decay of conditional externality from surrounding populations. If you are living nearby, but you are also searching for animals, then higher population in the neighboring communities affect my productivity in extracting resources. Okay, so we also find the significant estimates of these conditional and spatial decay parameters. Okay, then let me jump into the counterfactuals. And I will just jump into the conclusion. So, by combining well-targeted place-based protection policies that transport infrastructure achieve the higher welfare and improved human welfare and conservation. And let me describe the kind of not so-called optimal policies that could achieve this win-win outcome. This was achieved by protecting the rural frontier and transport infrastructure that connects hinterland to the center. Okay? Just by definition, so you see that in all river basins, actually, belongs to different areas, we see higher welfare, less deforestation, and less natural resource depletion compared to the benchmark equilibrium. And just by definition, these X marks, red X marks, are areas that encourage resettlement of populations. in the way to shrink the rural frontier, outer edge within the river basin where human settlements is advancing into undeveloped areas. And these red river lines represent the location where transport infrastructure is upgraded. Okay. Then the intention is as follows. First, by protecting rural frontiers, now surrounding population density in most areas for most of populated areas increases by creating a more compact area for human settlements, right? The overall area for human settlement is now more compact, such that congestion externality with spatial spillover from surrounding population increases and productivity of natural resource extraction decreases in most areas. That leads to decrease overall natural resource depletion. Okay, and the intuition behind the impact of the transport infrastructure. So this mainly works for increasing welfare by reducing water costs, obviously, and importantly, reduce deforestation. Total deforestation is decreased by spreading the agglomeration benefits more evenly across the river basin. And total deforestation is decreased given the complex structure of conditional forces in access to land, because by integrating hinterlands can reallocate farmers from central to more remote areas. That creates more medium-sized communities across the basin. That's why settlement size, overall settlements variance in the river basin decreases. That's why the total deforestation decreases. At the same time, agricultural productivity in remote areas increase due to the agglomeration externality. That's why, so this implies that, even development is better for reducing deforestation than uneven development. So this is the intuition behind the impact of transport infrastructure on reducing total deforestation. Okay. I think that's all. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Okay, I have three quick ones.
Yeah.
In the data, what is the change in the population improvement in Amazon over time? In your counterfactual, do you allow the total population improving Amazon to change? And third, could you remind me what your measure of natural resource depletion is?
Sure. Okay. So we don't have much data, but as far as I can see, total population is kind of stable in each river basin, and in all counterfactuals, I'm fixing the total population in each river basin, such that only we see reallocation of population within the river basin while fixing the total population. This means that deforestation, for example, reduced deforestation is not big because of the reduced total population and so on. And finally, so the final question is about the measure of total resource depletion is actually this is the opposite of total natural resource extraction, based on production functions that we are using the model. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not it's not just trees, it's also like hunting and fishing.
Yeah. So in this case, deforestation is how many trees they cut, and then this natural resource depletion is not about tree. This is the kind of common sum of other natural resources such as fishing, hunting, and forest products.
Okay. Yeah, that's coming from your prior data.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there's any mining in this context, like artisanal, small scale mining.
We have gold minings, but we have gold minings in a very different area. In this area, mining is very minor. we have also oil mining also, it's very limited. Yeah.
So in this context, the natural resource extraction really is the hunting and fishing.
Yeah,
Which has these clear sort of congestion.
yeah.
Any other questions or comments? So I thought this, I just thought your results at the beginning about sort of the density associated with deforestation is super interesting, just in terms of thinking about, you might have some people moving out to the frontier and they're sort of the deforesters, and you have other people sort of living in towns or, more condensed, and there's a lot less per capita deforestation. So that was super interesting, just like descriptive fact. And I was wondering how much of it is the people who are per capita not deforesting much, are they engaged in agriculture, or how much is it like non-agriculture? Like I live in a town, and I understand in this context, the town is probably very small and very focused on agriculture, but still, how many is just like people are doing other non-agriculture activities in the town and therefore not contributing directly? Whereas on the frontier, everyone's doing agriculture.
So interestingly, even in locations where locations closer to the main city, actually most populations are engaging in agricultural resources. So these two activities are the main activities for most rural communities. That's why we the decrease of natural resources, so this per capita deforestation may not be mainly stemming from the change in the sector that we are working on, but actually that's why we are thinking that the primary cause is the congestion forces in forest clearing, given the persistent activity of agriculture across the
So just thinking in terms of thinking about like another sector, right, which is non-agriculture, non-resource, like urban services, right? Is another way to you could really increase density without generating these.
Yeah, to generate, I think increasing productivity without, for example, service sector. So
yeah, so
we
thinking
can also
in terms of like exactly like in terms of like a structural transformation type perspective.
Yeah, I have to do this kind of work in maybe another thing.
Yeah, very cool.
More relevant. Yeah. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll move on to our last presenter. I think we're doing fine with time. So Gabriel Englander from the World Bank is going to present research on privatization of parks in Africa and conservation outcomes.
Thank you. So, well, I'll just say my co-authors are Sean Denny from UC Santa Barbara and Patrick Honeycutt from Chapman University. In this paper, we're comparing the performance of an NGO managing a protected area in Africa to the usual counterfactual of government management of a protected area and seeing who does better. Protected areas are important because they're the main method by which we try to conserve wildlife around the world. They're prevalent in Africa, where they cover 60% of land area. They can benefit people as well as wildlife through employment opportunities in the park, infrastructure that gets built with parks, tourism provides economic benefits. However, many protected areas in Africa do not realize their full potential benefits for people and wildlife due to security, financial, and technical challenges. Partly as a consequence, there's a trend of African governments inviting NGOs to manage national parks on their behalf. So this is different from what Anna in the first presentation talked about of WWF is providing advice, the government can choose to act on it or not. In this case, we're talking about what's called a delegated management model. So we're evaluating the largest of the NGOs that does this work, African Parks, call them AP. They have complete responsibility over park management. So hiring, firing, raising all the money, doing all the patrolling. They enter into contracts with governments, which last on average for 20 years. At the end of the contract, you need a new one, otherwise management authority reverts to the government. AP is interested in a particular kind of park. those that are large and contain or have the potential to contain large megafauna. They're only interested in parks where the full ecological and evolutionary processes can unfold. They've come to manage 22 parks in 12 countries over the last 20 years in every region of sub-Saharan Africa. There's 5 pillars of their management model, the most important of which is law enforcement. So they hire lots of rangers, give them the best equipment and training, collect data on where they're patrolling, hunting incidents, feed it into decision-making software. They put the most emphasis on that because they believe that if they cannot prevent wildlife in their parks from being killed by humans, they will not achieve their goal of healthy ecosystems. 4 other pillars. Second one is community development. This mostly means building and funding health clinics and schools in nearby villages. Restoration means if rhinos have been extirpated from an area, they will bring rhinos from somewhere else and reintroduce them. Tourism, they'll often contract to a third-party vendor who will market the park domestically and internationally, and then be in charge of doing the part of the program. Finally, infrastructure for the tourists, but also for their rangers. So building roads, electricity. One thing I'm always asked is why would the government want to give up control over an asset like a national park? The first reason is most parks in Africa are losing money. Their revenue from tourism is much less than the cost of maintaining the park. So this is an opportunity for governments to take a cost off of their balance sheet because AP is going to turn around and raise money for the park. And governments might believe that AP will be more successful at raising money from Western donors like the European Union to the extent that the European Union believes AP will be more able to avoid corrupt practices. Governments may also believe that AP will be more effective at law enforcement or even community development than they would. And finally, governments may believe that AP will increase tourism to their country more than they would be able to do. We have a staggered rollout differences identification strategy. We're going to use this one in Abraham 2021 estimator to account for differential treatment timing. We're always going to control for functions of temperature and precipitation. On the left, the red polygons are those that come to be managed by AP at some point during our study period. You can see the number of parks entering into treatment on the right. The purple polygons are parks that have always been managed by governments. These are going to be our control parks. These come from an internal study that AP did where a couple of years ago where they said, we think we have a successful management model. We've expanded in the past. We'd like to continue expanding in the future. What are the parks that meet our criteria for future management that are similar to the parks in our current portfolio in the sense of being large, having the potential for large impact? How good are these control parks though? So let's look at balance versus observables. In terms of the area, location, precipitation, they are similar. However, the treatment parks, those that are managed by AP, experience more extreme heat, so greater degree days above 32 Celsius. We see a remarkable difference in pre-period outcomes. I'll explain each of these in the subsequent slides, but whether we consider elephant poaching, bird abundance, measures of tourism, measures of armed conflict, asset wealth, the parks that will go on to be transferred to AP are worse in the pre-period than the control. So this suggests that governments are selectively transferring their most challenging parks to AP. AP has a tough task to improve these outcomes. We see a similar pattern when we consider management indices that I'll also explain, where across all 4 indices, the parks that will go on to be transferred to ATP score lower. I'm going to begin. I have 3 sets of outcome variables. The first are wildlife, because that's the main goal of protected areas. To use wildlife data, it has to be collected in the same way over space and time, or there has to be information on survey efforts so that we don't think, oh, there's more birds, but in fact you just look longer for birds. And then of course, the data has to exist for enough parks and years for us to run the Sun and Abraham estimator. There's only 2 data sets that meet these criteria in Africa. The first is called monitoring the illegal killing of elephants. This comes from rangers when they're out on patrol. They record the number of poached, illegally killed elephants and the number of natural mortality carcasses. The outcome variable is the proportion of illegally killed elephants type, which is the number of poached carcasses divided by the number of poached plus natural mortality carcasses. This measure controls for survey effort and the underlying elephant population under an estimate. Second data set comes from eBird. This is a citizen science platform that maybe some of you have submitted data to. Anybody can go out on a birding trip and submit the bird species and number of individuals that they see. And they also submit how long they looked for, how many people were in their party, and how far they traveled, so we can control for survey effort. The eBird data is the only one where we're going to keep it at the individual bird or trip level. That's because we're replicating the specification from the Liang et al. 2021 PNAS paper that analyzed eBird as a way of limiting researcher degrees of freedom, and because the effort, as the survey effort variables are also at the bird or trip level. So we're just going to control for it at that level. But for everything else, for elephant poaching and everything else, it's going to, the unit of observation is the protected area. And we cluster standard errors at the protected area level because that's the level of street misses. We find that AP management reduces elephant poaching by 15 percentage points. ATT is average treatment effect on the treated. This is a greater than 30% reduction in elephant poaching relative to the mean among control parks. Second, we find an increase in bird abundance of 37%. For both of these outcomes, not only are the pre-period levels different in the places that go on to be transferred to AP, but we also see a deteriorating trend in the, so I'll just show you like for elephant poaching. Okay, I won't. Where, not only is there these different levels, but there's also an increase in elephant poaching in the pre-period. So an upward trend in the pre-period coefficients, and for bird abundance, it's a downward trend in pre-period coefficients for bird abundance. We think this means that we're more likely to underestimate the improvement due to AP management because these outcomes are not subject to mean reversion. Because Pike controls for the elephant population level, if you have elephant poaching, you're just going to continue to have it unless something changes. Similarly, if your bird populations are decreasing, you're not going to tend to recover substantially on their own. So that's our claim, and robustness checks. I can show this quantitatively a bit with the Robish and Rob 2023 estimate. Second set of outcomes is tourism, which AP might be able to increase compared to government management if they're better at marketing, if they build better infrastructure, and we think that AP management is increasing wildlife populations. That's why people come to protected areas, so tourism could increase after the wildlife populations. There's no administrative data of tourism visits for many protected areas in Africa. So we're going to use 2 proxies. The first is iNaturalist. This is like eBird, except you can submit other animals and also plant observations. We're going to ignore the actual animal or plant data submitted because iNaturalist doesn't have survey effort, so we can't use it as a measure of wildlife. But what we can say is, if we see an iNaturalist observation in a protected area in a year, and we think it's not a staff person, we're going to call that a visit. And we use eBird data a second time, but in the same way. If you see an observation, that's a visit to the park. For both of these, our main measure is going to be an extensive margin of was there any visits to the park in a year. Here, the three trends are flat, so we don't need to worry. And for both outcomes, we find about a 40 percentage point increase in the probability of any visits to the park as measured in the two data sets. Final set of outcome variables concerns people who live within 25 kilometers of protected areas. First, we consider economic development. So I mentioned AP is building schools and health clinics. Most of the people who work in their parks come from nearby villages. We're going to measure economic development with asset wealth panel data from the firm Atlas AI. They train machine learning models to predict asset wealth in the demographic and health survey data, mostly using daytime satellite imagery as the input, and then they predict asset wealth for all other places and times that don't have DHS data with the trained model. Second, we consider measures of armed conflict, which may be affected by AP management to the extent that AP is doing more enforcement than ever. We're not able to conclude whether AP affects asset wealth because we have an upward trend in asset wealth in the pre-period. So we don't know whether this post effect is due to AP management or whether these places were just developing faster. So it's different from the wildlife ones where the pre-trend went in the opposite direction from the post-period coefficients. Here they're going in the same direction. We can't say anything, unfortunately. For conflict, we find an increase in the probability of any violence against civilians of about 8 percentage points, which is about a 50% effect compared to the minimum control areas. This is a concerning result. We think that it could be coming from AP displacing rebel groups and militias who previously were, say, hunting in the park or using the park's resources. Now AP displaces them. They still have to raise money for their operations, so they expropriate from nearby villages. However, we do not find an effect on whether the probability of any battles, the probability of any protests, and we also don't find an effect on the number of violence against civilian events. And finally, this increase in the probability of any violence against civilians is coming from 3 parks, 2 in Benin and then Rama National Park in DRC, which are active conflict zones. If you look at the remaining 19, there's no effect. So why does AP management improve wildlife and tourism outcomes, but not armed conflict? To understand what AP is doing differently from governments, we use data from the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, which is a group exercise filled out by protected area managers, staff, villagers, government officials, people from other NGOs, whoever wants to show up to this meeting. They do this occasionally for some parks. The data are so sparse that we can't even run the Summary Abraham estimator. This is going to just be a two-way fixed effects regression. Researchers group the 30 questions in the main module into 4 management indices. So I'm going to follow that and then standardize them. So the coefficients are going to be in standard deviations. And you can see the names of these kind of tell you the questions that go into the indices. We will control for who is in the room, and we'll control for whether the project is funded by GEF, the Global Environment Facility, because to get continued GEF funding, you have to improve on the net score, in addition to the protected area and your fixed effects. In general, we find large coefficient estimates, but due to the sparse data, only one will be statistically significant. We find a 0.7 standard deviation insignificant increase in design and planning. AP has a standard operating procedure that they apply to all of their parks. So on day 1, they come in with a lot of plans that they then try to implement. We see an insignificant 0.6 standard deviation in capacity and resources, suggesting that AP is able to raise more funds and increase staff headcount more than governments. Third, we find a statistically significant increase of almost 1 standard deviation in monitoring and enforcement, which accords with AP's focus on that as its first and primary pillar of its management model. Finally, we find an insignificant decrease of 0.3 standard deviations in decision-making inclusiveness, which we understand as AP values total management authority. They won't work somewhere where they don't have that. So, these data are self-reported. There's other caveats, but there are only opportunities to understand what AP might be doing differently from governments quantitatively, and the fact that the results accord with our qualitative understanding of AP conferences. So that's what I've got. Compared to the usual counterfactual of government management, it seems that private management by NGOs, or by one NGO, the largest one, of a protected area in Africa, is good for wildlife, good for tourism, increases one measure of conflict, and we think that one thing that's driving this is AP doing more monitoring and enforcement. Thanks a lot.
So maybe I have one question regarding bears are huge.
Yeah.
And what happens? I imagine there would be meetings within the
Mm-hmm.
What happens there once?
So I visited a park in Republic of Congo managed by a different NGO, so Wildlife Conservation Society. I think it's somewhat similar, so I'll just talk about what happened there. So WCS took over this park, Mobile National Park, in 2014. They built, just like AP, they built a school and a health clinic. They fund it every year. Basically 70% of households in the 3 villages closest to the park work in the park as rangers and trackers. I think depending on the context, if you were herding your cattle in the park or hunting in the park before, probably it's harder to do that now. And the third thing that was interesting to me from visiting this park in the Republic of Congo is that the biggest challenge is economic migrants actually coming from DRC, because there's this honeypot effect where in this one park that I know about, at least, economic development really was increasing. There's a lot of kind of burgeoning land for folks along. So that's what I think.
Because I just thought that I was curious that acquisition costs and sort of so they're
Yes,
since you're essentially displacing people and restricting people.
that's right. That's right. I think it's not always so.
So, yeah, very interesting. Thanks. So I have two questions. The first is about the biodiversity outcome. I was very convinced by the hike outcome, but then can I just, I want to see how we can interpret the bad outcome, especially because the increase of observation is coming from increase of tourism, right?
Oh, so it's
There are more tourists, so that they are more likely to have the e-bikes up. They are more likely to report.
Yes.
But in fact, maybe just flying over where people are coming. So I'm just see how this increase of observation is actually related to the improvement biodiversity.
Yes, so the unit of observation is the individual birder trip. So it's within a trip, controlling for birder effort, they're seeing more birds, which suggests that the bird population is increasing. We do a lot of robustness checks to see, like, could it be that birder skill is increasing? Could it be that AP is taking them to more bird abundant places, taking tourists differentially to more bird abundant months of the year? The first one, actually skill decreases. So it seems that AP is making these areas more accessible. And so you get kind of less hardened birders coming. But for the second and third ones, AP actually is bringing people to better places in the park, like where they're more likely to see birds in general. And they're differentially bringing them like a higher fraction in more bird abundant months of the year. So the birders themselves are less skilled, but the tourism operators are more skilled. And so for the second and third ones, when we account for that change in the composition, it does reduce the ATT somewhat, but it's still about 20 or 25%, even when we account for bird.
I think it's something that, And just a second point, very small related to our question, but do you see, I think the increased conflicts are concentrated in Beni and DRC.
That's right.
Do you see increase in tourism in these parks? Because then there are more targets.
That's right. That's a great question. I would guess not. I don't know about Benin, but I went to this park in the Republic of Congo, but I was at first going to go to like Eastern DRC, but like you can't go there right now. So I don't think there's many tourists going to Garamba right now.
Oh, I see.
Benin has like jihadists like active in the area, so I also doubt that there's any tourists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like this presentation, and then I like the way, why the government failed, and why they are working. But I mean, in the long term, it's such a pity that the government was supposed to be strong, have strong institutional capacity to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But when they don't, it's not much to, at the end of the day, what we need is at least for sometimes, there's a commission for the wildlife. But I was expecting something on your recommendation that in the future, okay, this is what it is. And then, the government admitted that there's a better way of doing it, fine. But gradually that has to be, the government needs to take responsibility in terms of
Yes.
Moral values, important number of things.
Yeah.
So I don't know what do you think are going to come in 20 years. So that's how it should go.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that dependency syndrome will continue.
Right.
And then if you say withdraw for any reason, political reason, or for anything next year, the government will go back.
Mm-hmm.
And then it will be complete crash.
Right.
So the only way to sustain these kind of things, whichever they go up and down, success is not a linear thing. But how do you see that this can really, if I was a government, I see how they do it, nice. And now it's nice. How do you really guarantee how it's data driven?
Yeah.
You see how they manage it.
Yeah.
You see how they perform better than we do.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's my responsibility. This was my own thing. Then how do you see, that transition from lessons were taken, but sustained? And in the editor might be even very interested because I'm so proud I did it and I want to continue doing it. That it might not really work with the government to pass all those lessons. So I would like to hear your feedback.
I completely agree with your sentiment. I think that that's one critique you can make of AP is they don't do capacity building. like other NGOs would do. That's not something they emphasize. In fact, these control protected areas, like I said, come from, they want to manage, more and more parks in Africa. So this is a delegated management model. A different one is more like co-management, where the NGO is working with the government, trying to increase their capacity. I agree that is the long-term goal we should work toward. And there does seem to be some trade-off because in a co-management, the government doesn't have to listen to you. I mean, so it would be very interesting to examine that trade-off of like this delegated management, maybe, it's only a temporary solution, but like, can you actually do the capacity building successfully? I'm not sure. Conceptually you could, but I haven't seen research on that for wildlife conservation.
What is the process for, the government transitioning or handing over to AP management? What kinds of, is there any consultation and consent with communities and local authorities? Just what does that process look like?
Yeah. So the each process is slightly different and the details are confidential. We only learn about one of these contracts after the fact. And in fact, I don't think the contracts are public.
Does AP have any standards or guidelines for how they profess themselves to do it?
For getting local consent, I don't know. My guess is that they are focused on like the central government authority, and an area for improvement for them would be getting local consent and making sure that people are compensated. I think they do a bit of that, but every year there's a bad news story for them that suggests they can improve.
So first of all, this is a fantastic paper. It's a really cool creative use of great data in a context where it's hard to find these things across all these different countries. So super cool. First of all, just to clarify, are they being paid by these governments, or is it purely like you have the right and you can raise your own revenues and make, so they're not like getting paid?
The government gives them no money.
Okay.
So 100%, they fund everything. If tourism revenue occurs, they'll even give some money back to the government. So far, that hasn't happened. They just broke even in Akagera National Park in Rwanda, so maybe they'll start to give some money there.
Okay. Do they charge again? Like for example, in Kenya, you have nationally managed parks.
Yeah.
Incredibly high capacity management.
Yes.
Of course, they're parks which receive tons of tourists, and so they're probably very profitable.
Yeah.
And you pay a big entrance fee, which goes to conservation efforts.
Mm-hmm.
Are they charging entrance fees for tourists in their parks?
They are, but for 21 of the 22, the tourism revenue is less than what they're spending.
I have just a few little comments or questions. So throughout the paper, you sometimes use like continuous outcomes. Sometimes you use, like a dichotomized binary outcome. Mm-hmm. For example, with tourism, it's just do they receive any tourists?
Yep.
And I guess there are some parks that literally don't receive any, which I find.
Right. I mean, it's about half.
Yeah. So what? I guess just out of curiosity, if you look at a continuous outcome of tourism.
Yeah, we do. These buttons aren't working for me, which is sad, but we have that as robustness checks in the paper. They're both positive. One is statistically significant. One is not.
My final question is going back to Anna's point. Some of these areas are absolutely massive, right? And there must be probably people living in different capacities on this land. Yeah. Some traditional livelihood, some refugees or migrants or armed groups or whatever the case. So I was just wondering, you could sort of look at that with either land use spatial data or nightlight data.
Right.
And see if there's changes when African Parks takes over.
Right.
You looking for that?
So the closest thing we do is the asset well, which is trained on daytime and nighttime satellite imagery. We didn't try to take it further of like, well, I mean, we didn't do night lights because I just don't think we're gonna see much in these rural areas. And that's kind of what's nice about the asset wealth is you're using the daytime imagery.
And for that, are you looking like inside the parks or around the parks?
So it's an inclusive 25-kilometer buffer.
Because it would be super interesting to look inside the parks and around the parks, you know, because if they push people out.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
And just also just descriptively, it'd be really interesting how much human activity exists inside these parks. It probably varies a lot across countries.
Right.
Very close to the border, the farms, people are going, they go.
Yeah, and knowing the initial levels of conflict too.
Yeah, well, I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you allow me, I'm going to sit with Jeff, science, technology advisory panel.
Great.
For instance.
Okay.
And then if you want to really pitch it for them to support, because I heard you mention Jeff.
Yes.
Jeff pays only for 3 Rio conventions, climate, biodiversity, and Milan. Which one do you go for? Or Jeff is so interested on multiple benefits.
Right.
Just for one.
I see.
And then taking that into account.
Yeah.
And then if you really submit this, it's just a biodiversity, small, high uncertainty. Do I need to really encourage that? Or what is going to be your pitch if you want to really get a different?
I see. Yeah, I mean, because we don't look at forest outcomes. Part of that is a lot of these areas, like not all of them are in forests, so we might not see something. Also, like most of the literature is about forests, so we thought like a value add could be looking at everything else. I don't know, you're asking like if I worked for AP, how would I fundraise from Jeff or something?
You have a project that you know.
Yes.
And then you'll be an ambassador for whatever it is.
Right.
Resourcing always good to report things.
Yeah.
And you're going to send it to your proposal.
Right.
Jeff is going to evaluate it.
Yeah.
And then if it's good enough, it's going to be fair.
Right.
And it will solve some of
Yeah.
different issues.
I got it.
So yeah, just represent your project from whichever angle and then want to submit your proposal.
Sure. I think that our strongest evidence is for the biodiversity outcomes. So I feel pretty confident saying that like for the two things we can observe, elephants and birds, AP does better than governments do. And then, but yeah, we don't look at forests. And then, the tourism is the other one that looks good.
Yeah, and if you're asking me, actually, it's coming from the other side. If
Yeah.
you do better, it's really good to have the primary benefit is what,
Yeah. Yeah.
Always think about the co-benefits.
Right.
Biodiversity cannot stand by its own without primary mitigation and adaptation.
I see.
It cannot stand by its own without having, the whole range management, carrying capacity and land and so those kind of things. But I mean, it would be nice to, this is the main benefit. These are also the potential of benefits that it brings kind of systemic thinking on
That's right.
that way.
Yeah.
Would be one way we use it because biodiversity cannot stand by its own.
Right.
It's always put together nexus.
Right.
Appropriate system thinking, and then if you add a little bit on that, that would be really
Okay. Okay, I mean, so I'll share that another reason we didn't look at forests is there's a different paper that is evaluating not just AP, but all of the NGOs that do this, compared to governments, how is deforestation different? And so they're already doing that for the one outcome variable, but for all of the NGOs. And if it would help you, I could see if they have a draft of the paper, and then kind of combining the two papers, I think we studied kind of most of the outcomes to think about.
I just wanted to chime in and say that at the WRI we're developing data sets right now on grassland conversion.
Okay.
So it's helpful.
This is great. So if anyone wants to keep talking, of course, we have the rest of this conference. So thank you so much for your participation.